Okay, it's just past midnight, which makes it the morning of June 27th, Monday morning. It's about 12:20 a.m. I was just thinking some more about what came on the other side of this tape, that moment when mass strikes mass, when mass connects with mass, and at that point the gravitational fields between them turn into one gravitational field. In other words, no longer being looked at as two separate masses, but as one single mass. Therefore, it's crossed the limit line. What happens when mass touches mass? Well, we say that there's a straight line progression, some sort of a linearity that could chart the distance between them. And the distance between them would be a line of some sort or another, either an angled line or a straight line, meaning that it's horizontal, vertical, or some angle that eventually would chart the distance down to zero. And when it gets down to zero, of course, that would be at 0, 0. And this would allow for acceleration, is that it could follow some sort of a curve even, but the end point of that curve would be at 0, 0. Meaning that there was no longer any acceleration between the two, no longer any speed between the two, no longer any distance between the two. They have, in fact, become a single entity. Now, it occurred to me that that's true when you're looking from the perspective of seeing the gravitational field become nil at the point that the two masses become one. However, if you start looking at the masses at a different fractal level and you realize that they get closer and closer, but when do they actually touch? Well, that depends on how much mass you have. You're talking mathematically as a single point. Well, eventually they arrive at the same point, and that's true. But in the physical world, you actually have masses that are made up of collections of atoms. And these collections of atoms get together, and the atoms eventually reach a point where two atoms, one from mass A and one from mass B, come into conjunction that is as close as the distance between two atoms within mass 1 or two atoms within mass B. At that point, when the distance between the closest atoms from mass A and mass B is equal or less than the distance between two atoms within mass A or within mass B, we can say that the two masses have joined as one in a definitive sense. However, they really have never touched because, in fact, in order for them to reach a nil point where they become a single mass, we cannot be able to chart it spatially across the size of any given mass. Mass A, if it is not a single mathematical point, has distance within it between at least two atoms, or within the atom within a single atom, a distance between the protons or the neutrons within the nucleus. No matter how much we subdivide it until we get down to the elemental mathematical point, they never will really touch, which means we end up with another hyperbolic curve, but in this case, the hyperbolic curve is not reaching a limit line of gravitational attraction, but we're reaching a limit line of physical proximity. And suddenly, there is no more linearity at that point. Dropping through the fractal levels, we see that at the mathematical single point, there is a linearity, but anything above that single mathematical essence, there is only approaching the limit line. Now, because they're approaching the limit line again, that means that we must be turning into a linearity in terms of the gravitational field. In other words, at some point, gravitation has to cease, looking at that fractal level. When we look at the masses as occupying space as opposed to just being mass, then as soon as they occupy space, that means that in that sense, there is a linearity or a binary state to gravitation, where it is either there or it is not between two objects. That binary state then hypothesizes that in the real world, gravity will cease in the universe as we see it. At some point, gravity will cease to exist. So one of the predictions of mental relativity is that in a real world in which we see that every mass must occupy space and cannot exist short of occupying space, gravity at some point will cease to exist when two masses get within a certain distance of each other. And that will be a curve or a linearity of some sort. Now, because of the nature of two masses getting close together, and if they get mathematically close together to the point that they become a single point, then what happens to the force that drew them together? It can't dissipate completely. In fact, if the straight line comes to the point of 0, 0, because it's a vector, it must continue past 0, 0. Now, what happens if you have two masses that become so close that they not only connect and become a single entity, but then pass through each other, as it were, right through each other, not through the open space. We're talking mathematical points now that that exist only in theory. That we have two mathematical points that occupy no space, but have space between them. They get closer and closer through some kind of measure of distance between them, meaning that they have energies, vectors of energy that are working in opposite directions. They arrive at a point of 0, 0, at which they actually become one. That is the only point at which they can touch, is when they become one. Otherwise, it's only gravitational forces that are working. And as soon as they become one, then what happens to the energy? Well, they have to pass through each other. Now that means the energy will apparently dissipate. That means that the energy will apparently cancel itself out. Inertia is the force we're looking at here. Forget about acceleration for a moment, because acceleration will show itself in moving the single point that has been created out of the 2 points coming into conjunction, as moving that single point in one direction or another based on the combined vectors of the forces at work. But what about inertia when two forces come together, one moving from the left to the right, one moving from the right to the left, horizontally across a straight line? They arrive at a point where they coincide and occupy the same point, not space, but they occupy the same point because they have no space, only mass. At that point, what happens to those two energy vectors? Does energy just cease to exist? No, this is what they think may be going on in subnuclear physics, but what's really happening is that you're creating something where they pass through each other and continue in their different directions. Well, why is it then that we don't see this happening in the real universe? When two things merge, they stay merged. Because we're working at a different fractal level here. And we're not talking about two objects actually coming together to become one. This is only what we hypothesize that happens when we're dealing with nuclear fusion. Now, when you're dealing with nuclear fusion, we're saying that two entities come together and give off energy, okay, and form a new mass. That is the wrong way to be looking at it to get any sense out of it. Because what's really happening is they're passing through each other. They pass through each other and move past the line of spatial existence. They move past that line and become negative mass. Now, we're not talking antimatter here. We're talking tendency theory, where we say something exists. How firmly does it exist? With how much vigor does it exist? There are always volatile atmospheres into which things can be created out of sheer probability, out of sheer possibility. Potentiality exists, but has not become manifest in any tangible sense. This is the way things come into creation out of no place, whether it be a thought, whether it be an object. When something passes that magic point, the magic point is going from not existing to existing. But that state of existing, when you look at it as a binary, means that out of nothing comes something. And who was it? Newton that said science is the greatest of all endeavors because it may allow us to determine why there is something rather than nothing. Well, the fact is, there isn't really something and there isn't really nothing. There's all kinds of potential to become, and things have always partially become, but never anything actually is. Nothing actually is. Things are only in the process of becoming, and they never actually aren't either. Now, this sounds a little strange, I'm sure, but what you really end up with is the concept of negative mass, not antimatter, but negative mass, something that has less of a tendency to come into being than zero. In other words, if two masses come together under opposite forces in a theoretical mathematical sense, 2 points that represent mass come together, but they contain no space within them, they only have space between them, then when that space between them becomes zero, the forces that push them together push them past each other into a situation of negative mass. Now, what does this mean? This means that one of them must have been negative mass to begin with. One of them must have been negative mass to begin with, because on this chart that we're looking at, we're not looking at two objects in real space. We're looking at one in negative space and one in positive space. A negative mass and a positive mass. Now, what you end up with is a sense not of antimatter, but a sense of negative space and antimass. And the complements then would be disenergy or disenergy, just put it all together in one word, and reverse time. On one side of this limit line, on one side of the point 0, 0, this single point is the conjunction for 4 dimensions. It works in 4 axes, and all 4 come together and converge at this single point. And when you carry each one of these axes past that point into the other half of its linearity, then taking each dimension and tracing its linearity backwards, when all of them are in the negative, you end up with anti-mass, negative space, disenergy, and reverse time. Now, how can we tell which universe is mass, energy, space, and time, and which universe is anti-mass, negative space, disenergy, and reverse time? Well, you can't. Whether you're in one or the other, you can't see the other one, because that point of 0, 0 is essentially the Big Bang. That's exactly what we end up with in the Big Bang. In other words, looking at the Big Bang as being the collapse of the universe from existence space is essentially half the equation. It appears to be like the top half of a sine wave. Now, when we look at something like that, we say, wait a minute, there's the top half of the sine wave, and they say, here's the Big Bang, and then everything stretches out, and then it comes screaming back to center, and there's the collapse of the universe back to 0. Now, what they look at is then immediately it goes from back to 0, and another Big Bang occurs, but that would be a series of humps on the top of the line. What's really happening is that cycle going back to the other side. And when it goes back to the other side, what do we end up with? We end up with everything that we have in this universe reaching that point of 0, 0, where there's no space, no time, no mass, and no energy. But that is only momentarily. That is only when everything cancels out, but its inertia carries it into the other side, into the negative universe, where we have negative mass, anti-space, negative space, anti-mass, disenergy, and reverse time. At that point, everything will continue to flower in the other direction in an expansion. Now, if it's passing through and going that way, something from the other side must be collapsing through and coming the other way. If you have the sine, you have the cosine, to put it simply. And so that's what gives the appearance of having a hump, 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 is we see on one side first the sine wave half cycle, then the cosine wave half cycle, then the sine wave half cycle. That's assuming we sit out here in the universe and watch. But we can't watch because we're going to be passing through. When we try in a theoretical sense to put ourselves into objectivism and look at the universe as if we could stand in it but not be affected by it, that's when we see these series of humps. if indeed we realize that we are subjective viewers, then because of the subjective viewing of it, then that's why we think it's going to be a series of humps. In reality, it is a sine wave and a cosine and all of the others. Remember, in mental relativity, there are two new trigonometric functions. That's why we had to invent quadranometry instead of trigonometry. We have the sine, cosine, secant, cosecant, tangent, cotangent, and dependent and codependent. Those two extra functions describe time as it is separated from space, rather than there being a space-time continuum. So now we look at our notion of the human mind dealing with change, dealing with moving from one binary state to another. And suddenly we have some tools to deal with that. We have tools to deal with going into negative thought. If we look at the same concepts where we have knowledge equals mass, thought equals energy, ability equals space, and desire equals time, we can see it much more clearly in a subjective sense when we look at ourselves and say we have knowledge of something or we have anti-knowledge. What would anti-knowledge be? What happens when you unlearn something? What happens when you have a certain amount of knowledge, and that knowledge diminishes and diminishes and diminishes until it reaches zero knowledge of something, forgetfulness, as it were, and then continues on past that to see patterns that could not be perceived when you had knowledge of it. In other words, to unlearn a subject so that you can see something fresh in it. That's exactly what's happening when you're talking about mass and anti-mass. You're talking about the journey into the creation of something that cannot be as long as mass exists. And it's a natural progression for one to destruct itself. Now, this destruction, this force of destruction, we all see extropy and entropy. Hold on a second. Let me take a look at something here with the light. Okay, we all see extropy and entropy. And when we're looking at extropy and entropy, what we're really looking at is energy and disenergy. Disenergy. Synergy and disenergy. Okay, energy, disenergy. What we're ending up with is a force that builds up and a force that builds down. A force that builds up to complexity by stretching things out, by separating them away, and a force that builds down to entropy by pulling them all together towards that single point. Now, as a result of that, when you're looking at knowledge, what is it that takes knowledge of something and disintegrates it down to no knowledge so that it can become a knowledge of something that could not be perceived as long as the original knowledge had existed, the anti-knowledge? Well, how does that anti-knowledge come into being? Because the process of disenergy decays the complexity of knowledge. It is entropy of knowledge. It pulls it down, down and down until it gets to a single point, and then that exact same force of disenergy passes the limit line and becomes energy to build it up into this new anti-knowledge. So in effect, what we end up with is energy is at work until you get to the point of 0, 0, 0, 0, and then disenergy is existing with anti-knowledge. But remember, if you take anti-knowledge and look at it in terms of disenergy, it just looks like energy and knowledge from the other side. But if you look at it objectively, stand outside that, and say what's happening as it passes through that limit line, then you can see the process of disenergy working to unbuild knowledge. And it crosses the line and it becomes energy coming out the other side that is thought, that is building up new knowledge. So in other words, thought and anti-thought. Thought and anti-thought. Thought appears to build up knowledge, anti-thought appears to tear it down. When in reality, the real anti-thought, from an objective standpoint, is once you've gotten knowledge down to zero and thought continues and builds up another knowledge that could not have existed until the first knowledge was eliminated because it blocked a point of view. It created a blind spot. It created a given. And until that given was removed, something in contradiction to that given could not be accepted. Therefore, from an objective standpoint, thought can serve to build up knowledge, but it can also serve to build it down. And when thought has built knowledge down to the point that knowledge is zero, it becomes anti-thought or dis-thought, unthought, and anti-knowledge. Now again, if we're comparing space and ability, what is happening when we end up with negative space? Well, negative space is the equivalent of negative ability. In other words, if you have a situation in which ability is degrading until it reaches zero, if you have no ability in a situation, what happens if you develop an ability to screw it up? Well, if you develop an ability to screw it up, that's even worse than having no ability at all. Not only are you passive or unable to accomplish something, but you cannot help but disaccomplish it. You have a negative impact on your purposes by merely acting. The more you act, the more it becomes negative. In other words, Chris once said to me that sometimes you have to push something in order to make it come towards you. This begins to jump around a lot of different fractal levels, a lot of different frictal levels. It begins to talk about the relationships between mass, energy, time, and space, pushing something to make it come towards you. Well, that's what happens when negative ability is at play. If negative ability is at play, the more you push, in other words, they say sometimes in the phrase, the faster you go, the behinder you get. There was a book called On Stranger Tides that I once read, a pirate story about magic and pirates. And the magic was that when they got to the Fountain of Youth, they were trying to arrive at it, which actually existed, and they could see it. But the more they walked towards it, the farther away it got. The faster they moved towards it, the more quickly it receded. In fact, they had to take a surreptitious route where they moved away from it in a particular direction in order to arrive at it. This concept kind of boggles the mind. It deals very nicely, however, with warped space, black holes, and quasars. And what you end up with is sometimes your abilities not only degrade to the point that they become zero, but that they increase in a negative sense so that everything you do works against your purposes. That's negative ability. However, if it's coupled, negative ability, with anti-knowledge and dis-thought or unthought or reverse thought, when you end up with that coupling, it appears to be a positive ability because now you're working to a new purpose of anti-knowledge. And of course, dis-thought is there to help build anti-knowledge into in a pattern of increasing negative ability. Now the final point is when you come to desire and reverse desire. You hear about attraction and repulsion. Attraction and repulsion. How can they both exist? You would think that if desire is the effective effective equivalent of time in the internal universe, then we would only have forward-moving desire. In other words, positive desire. If we only had forward-moving desire where we only said, I want this, I want this, I want that, I'd like this is something I'm going after, I'm attracted to this, I'm attracted this much or this much or this much, that would be something that was farther and farther in the future, more and more of a greater pull. You could end up with equivalence of the time dilation effect, where things would go from apparently freezing at a 0 point in which you had no desire at all, or they could accelerate to the point where they were going so fast you couldn't see them at the other opposite end of the size of the scale, which would be maximum desire. But remember, in relativity, external relativity, Einstein's relativity, you have the speed of light, which appears to be a constant because we're looking subjectively at an objective universe. And when we're looking inside ourselves, we're looking objectively at a subjective universe. And because of that, instead of being the time that can't be exceeded, the speed of light, it's the space that can't be exceeded, which is the size of mind. In other words, desire. The size of your desirability, I guess would be better, because you're going to blend desirability, at least in the male mind. The size of desire is going to be limited. It's going to appear constant. In other words, you have a certain amount of desire, and that desire will always be constant, but it's mitigated by anti-desire, by reverse desire. Reverse desire is repulsion. You're repelled from something. Now, when you're repelled from something, here's the reason that this serves as a good way for looking at the real universe, the external universe, is that we're talking about now being able to see within ourselves both sides of the scale, past the point 0, 0, 0, 0, where all four dimensions come together. Inside ourselves, we can see us reach the point of negative knowledge and then have knowledge, anti-knowledge, pop out the other side, clearly remembering that we used to see it one way, hold a certain given, a certain point of view, a certain prejudice, a certain bias, and now we don't. We clearly no longer hold it, and yet at the same time, we have established a new point of view that we can see that now we hold. No matter how open-minded you are, you've got to hold something or you have no mind at all. We can also see ourselves having a thought process that is tearing down knowledge and building up new knowledge once the old knowledge is torn down to zero. We can see our abilities getting to the point that when we try to deal with something, we're only screwing it up, and the harder we try, the more of a screw-up we create. We can also see that sometimes we're attracted to things and sometimes we're repelled to them. When you begin to look at that level, you're starting to look at things like magnetism, gravity, electrical charges. In other words, the weak forces of the universe. When you look at the weak forces and the strong forces, and you look at gravity, and you start realizing that there are going to be four kinds of forces at work, you're talking unified field theory here. Now, unfortunately, the exact math of it all eludes me, because I'm not a mathematician. I have a sense of pattern, and I have a sense of changing patterns and how they work. So somebody more qualified in math than I is going to have to work out the specific math. But clearly, an analogy can be drawn between looking at the external universe objectively instead of subjectively, and looking at the internal universe objectively. So we have the subjective view of the objective universe, which is how Einstein looked at things, and we have the objective view of the subjective universe, which is how mental relativity looks at things inside. And now we can turn them around and say, let's take a subjective view of the subjective universe, applying Einstein's rules to mental relativity, and seeing how we blend different dimensions within ourselves, which dimensions are blended just like space and time are blended externally. And we can also turn around and take mental relativity and say, now let's separate things and take an objective view of objectivity, of the objective universe outside ourselves, and split all the dimensions. Now, when we take Einstein's and we look at inside ourselves, we say, okay, in Einstein's universe, all of us, the entire species, looks at space and time as being blended together. They become one, space-time continuum. Inside, we end up with it not being the same way for all people. We look at men and we look at women, and we look at the spatial brain operating system and the temporal brain operating system. And what we end up with is, inside, we see us blending different yardsticks. In other words, men are going to blend ability and desire, and women are going to blend knowledge and ability. Now, when they blend knowledge and ability together, knowledge and ability is essentially one thing. The more you know, the more you are able. To men, those are separate entities, but they blend ability and desire. If there's no desire, there's no ability because they can't motivate themselves. If there's no ability, there's no desire because why want something you can't do? They've locked those together. So what have we created now between the external universe and the internal universe? We've created a triangle. We've created a triangle of saying, here is everybody looking at the universe as a space-time continuum. We all share that view. That's the intrinsic one to us. Remember, we can learn other ways of looking at it, but that's the intrinsic one, the one that operates with our own brain operating systems. That's the commonality between male and female minds as we see space and time blended together. However, when we look at our own inner minds, we can clearly see that there are two separate species, the male mind, or space brain operating system, or female mind, temporal brain operating system. And as a result of that two minds, we've created a triangle now. But as we know in mental relativity, everything is in a quad. And And what's the missing piece? The missing piece is when we start applying mental relativity of the objective view of subjectivity and use the objective view of objectivity in Einstein's universe. And the moment we do that is when we have to then split space and time, just as on the other side of this tape, looking at wavelength versus frequency, see what's really going on, realizing there's the sine and the cosine, realizing that there is antimass and negative space and disenergy and reverse time, and realize that those things do not exist independently.